is Kentucky's Voice Radio, covering the latest state and local issues with Tom Fallbush, Bob Scott, and Jim Waters.
And I am Jim Waters, welcoming you into the Hump Day version of Kentucky's Voice. Glad to have you with us. We're here every weekday, 11 to noon. Coming up on today's show, the IRS has clarified that pastors and churches can address political issues and even endorse candidates without violating their tax-exempt status. We're going to talk about why this should never have been an issue in the first place and what our founders intended when it came to the freedom of church and religion. Also, the Family Foundation is calling the ACLU's challenge to Senate Bill 2, which prohibits taxpayers from being forced to fund gender transition medication for Kentucky prison inmates, meritless. We'll be joined today also later on by Dan Schneider of the conservative Powerhouse Media Research Center, which is calling on senators to reject funding for public television and NPR. University leaders were in Frankfurt yesterday to update legislators on how they're complying with DEI legislation that was passed by the General Assembly this year. We'll cover that, and Andy Beshear continues to ponder a run for the presidency, probably the worst-kept secret in Kentucky, but few nationwide really know who he is. We'll talk a little more about that later on in the show, but first, I want to talk to you about this show and about this media project that you may have just happened on today. You may be new to this, or you may have been with us for a while, but I want to talk to you a moment about Kentucky's Voice. You know, this is an important project for so many reasons, especially as we're going to talk with Dan Schneider today about media bias. One thing's for sure, when you tune into Kentucky's Voice, we're offering a coverage of the news, analysis, opinion from a Christian, conservative, common sense point of view. We are welcoming your comments, and we're welcoming your contributions. You can text your comments to 502-571-0970, and you can text KY Voice, as you see on the screen there, to 53555 in order to contribute to this project. Now, we've looked at these types of projects, and it's really great that many states now have a conservative media voice like Kentucky's Voice, and many of them we found are supported by the folks who watch and believe in what they're doing and understand the importance of having a conservative media voice here that's going to be consistently conservative, consistently common sense, consistently willing to call out whatever political side there may not be adhering to Christian conservative common sense principles. So I want to encourage you today to partner with us. We have this unique opportunity to build a media powerhouse here, as I said, that's needed in Kentucky. Where else are you going to turn to here that is actually offering all of the time consistently reporting, analysis, and opinion from a conservative point of view? You know, sometimes we conservatives are bad about waiting until things go south, or, if you will, turn left in political terminology before we act. We tend to be reactive rather than proactive. But I want to change your thinking on that. I want you to think about becoming proactive. Right now, conservatism, populism, a populist version, I'll say, of conservatism is on the rise. But there will come a time when the pendulum will swing back the other way. It happens in politics. It happens throughout our history. It happens even in policy. The momentum will swing at times. When that happens, what you give today will make it possible for us to have this strong conservative voice tomorrow that cannot be silenced by an Andy Beshear executive order, no matter what's going on. And you know, if we have another COVID, we have another situation like that, what you give and support with this media effort means that we'll be here. Andy Beshear was in Frankfurt on a daily basis with his infomercial. The media was pretty easy on him. A lot of softball questions. They carried him, gave him lots of additional time under the guise of the governor updating the people. Of course, he used that largely as an infomercial to push his ideology about COVID, about the vaccines, about that whole agenda that he had. And there wasn't much of an answer to that. Well, the next time that happens, there needs to be an answer. And there needs to be an answer right now. Folks across the country need to know about his overreach of executive orders and executive power. And we've been moving in the wrong direction, both, I think, at the state level and the federal level when it comes to the overuse and abuse of executive power. We need to bring that back into balance. We need the voices of the people to be heard, and we need conservatives not just to be content to be the silent minority or silent majority. I believe the center right is the majority in America. You may be more on one end of that spectrum than others, and that's okay. But we all believe in limited government, individual liberty, less taxation. We believe people ought to be able to do what they want with their property without government telling them. We believe in a strong national defense and security. And so I invite you to partner with us today, and it's very simple. Just text KY Voice to 53555. That's 53555. And then I want to hear about your thoughts on the show, if we can put that number up as well, if we have it, once in a while here. But we want to hear what you think about what we're discussing today or have been discussing on this show. And there it is, 502-571-0970. And so we appreciate, we'll get to your thoughts as well today. First up today, we have the IRS settling a lawsuit with 2 Texas churches and the national religious broadcasters, clarifying that pastors and churches can address political concerns and even endorse candidates from the pulpit to their congregations without losing or risking their tax-exempt status. This is a consent decree, as it's called in judicial legal language, that protects internal church communications like sermons and newsletters as free speech. I was thinking about a few years ago when the mayor of Houston tried to, at that time, she's no longer the mayor there, but she tried to bully churches into what they could preach from their pulpits, and pastors began to stand up against that, and that's where this lawsuit came from. A new ruling from the IRS on this. There's also the Family Foundation of Kentucky. I would like to point you to a Q&A resource that they have put together that explains that pastors can speak biblically about candidates and issues to their congregation without legal risk, as long as it's not external campaigning. I mean, you can't go and do paid ads or public rallies. The IRS had long treated such endorsements as low risk under what we knew as the Johnson Amendment, but the 2025 ruling removes the legal gray area, affirming pastors' First Amendment rights. So the gray areas have been addressed here, and pastors are free to preach on the issues of the day, call out politicians that don't abide by those. Pastors will be able to speak on issues like life and marriage and religious freedom. With the elections coming up, they do not have to be silent about those things. And I think this aligns with our founders' vision of religious liberty. You know, the First Amendment guarantees the right to freedom of religion, and the founders, I guarantee you, were not concerned about pastors overstepping their bounds in the churches. They were concerned about the government overstepping its bounds, which we've seen it approaching that line at times in telling pastors what they could and could not do in their pulpits, what they could and could not say. John Adams said that the Constitution was for a moral and religious people. George Washington called religion and morality indispensable supports for political prosperity. Benjamin Franklin noted that only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Moral restraint driven by faith and conscience, they said, is vital for liberty. So they believed in the work of the church and in the necessity of faith in order to make this new, at that time, new experiment in representative republicanism, in representative democracy, if you will, to make it work. They were concerned about 2 things primarily. One is that the government would try to silence the churches and the pastors, and or that government would try to dictate to the church what could and could not be taught and done and interfere with the autonomy of the church. We saw that here during COVID with this governor who sent the state troopers out to record the license plate numbers of those who attended church on Easter Sunday during COVID because they were violating his order. I always found that curious, though, because how is it that some businesses and some workers can be considered essential, others are considered non-essential, and that those decisions are made very subjectively by a governor whose ideology was bigger government, more government, telling people what they could and could not do. How does that work when Walmart can stay open but the church can't be open? And that we're not going to take down the license plates of Walmart shoppers, but we certainly will take down the license plates of Christians worshiping on Easter. That is what the founders, those are the things that they were most concerned about when it came to government and religion. They weren't concerned about pastors unduly influencing the government. They understood that pastors had a role to play, and they did play a big role in the founding of our nation. And they understood that without the church and without faith, that this experiment in representative democracy would not work. And they understood that people had to be morally restrained in order to handle and to make this experiment in individual liberty and freedom work, which the world had never seen on that level before. So how are people morally restrained? By the convictions of their conscience, by the determination of their faith that comes from worshiping God, worshiping his son Jesus Christ, and by the power of the Holy Spirit to restrain mankind from sinning, harming others, and convicting him when he does. So this ruling by the IRS simply clarifies what we already believe, that churches and pastors have unrestrained freedom to state their beliefs, state their views, to preach the scripture, and to apply it to the common day in which we live, current events, including political events. Well, coming up, we'll be joined by Dan Schneider of the conservative powerhouse Media Research Center, which is calling on senators, including Kentucky Senior Senator Mitch McConnell, to vote for the package sent by President Trump to Congress, which would codify the DOJ cuts, including cutting over $1 billion for public broadcasting. We'll talk about it in a minute with Dan. Coming up, stay with us on Kentucky's Voice.
Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. Jim Waters here with you on this Wednesday. Glad to have you with us. Love to hear from you. 502-571-0970, our Kentucky's Voice text line there. We'll get to some of those later on in the program. But right now, we're just really delighted to have with us Dan Schneider, who is Vice President of the Media Research Center. which is arguing that NPR and PBS have unfairly targeted Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's judicial legacy while pushing a liberal agenda. He's written a new op-ed calling for defunding these outlets through House Resolution 4, which is it contains some of the DOJ cuts that would codify some of the DOJ cuts that have gotten a lot of attention, and we'll unpack that in a moment. But Dan, thanks for joining us here today. Glad to have you with us on the program. And let me say from the outset that I'm so appreciative of the work that you're doing at Media Research Center. And, this is a great organization. They've been exposing media bias. They've been holding the media's feet to the fire. I think it makes a difference when the media knows. We found out the same thing with politicians. It makes a difference when they know that somebody's paying attention to what they're saying and doing. It tends to make things better. It tends to make for better decisions. So let's hope that in the long run, that works with the media as well. But you always have a lot of evidence, and the article you've written is, I guess I was interested in this for a couple of reasons. One is a pretty strong defense of Senator Mitch McConnell, his record really, you said, and you write, for decades, Senator McConnell has been a towering figure in Kentucky and in Washington, D.C. His greatest accomplishment is the reshaping of the federal judiciary. No other person in the century deserves more credit than McConnell for restoring our courts to serve the interest of all Americans in the manner envisioned by our nation's founders. It's a legacy that will endure for generations. So talk a little bit about this, about your thinking on this. And it's very interesting here because there's a lot of folks on both sides about Senator McConnell as the jockeying begins on who's going to replace him, who's going to be the Republican nominee for that position. As you know, he's not running again. But talk a little bit about your thoughts about Senator McConnell, his record, and why that matters and why that should matter.
Jim, in my piece, I specifically narrow in on what he has done with judicial nominees, both during Democrat administrations and Republican administrations. That really is his shining legacy. As an appropriator, and on other issues, conservatives can have a different point of view on his legacy. But when it comes to nominations to the bench, both by left-wing presidents and by conservatives, he has set the standard. And the point I'm making for him, this frankly is like a personal plea to him. NPR and PBS have been merciless in attacking him for what he has done to the courts. Yet at the same time, when Chuck Schumer employs even more aggressive tactics than Mitch McConnell did, NPR and PBS praised Chuck Schumer. These radicalized media outlets, taxpayer-subsidized media outlets, exist now for one reason and one reason only, and that's to push for a hard left turn for America. And Mitch McConnell should not continue to allow taxpayers to be forced to subsidize these outlets.
Yeah, you talk about it in terms of betraying the public trust, the way that PBS and NPR related their public broadcasting in general has, at least on a national level, has really been so biased and so obviously biased in their coverage. I think that's what bothers people too. If you're on the fence about this, but you look at the difference, as you pointed out in the coverage between the way that PBS treated Mitch McConnell versus Chuck Schumer, that's just unfair at its basic root. And the left, the progressives, like to talk about fairness. Well, what about fairness here, right?
Look, Jim, it's beyond fairness. Because these are taxpayer-subsidized outlets by statute, the statute that created NPR and PBS, the statute that created those things, wanted to make sure that the people understood that they would not be, state-operated, state-controlled for a political party. So the statute requires NPR and PBS to, and I'm quoting the statute here, Jim, to strictly adhere to objectivity and balance in all programming. But NPR and PBS have refused to comply with the law. They openly defy the law. They have promised the American public that they will not cover the other side of climate change. They will not cover the other side of, is Trump a Russian asset? They would not cover the Hunter Biden laptop story. They openly said, we will not cover those issues. That's breaking the law. In all of their programming, they refuse to cover the other side. They are a mouthpiece for one side. They are serial lawbreakers. There's no reason why Kentuckians who work hard to be forced to have their taxes used to subsidize the media outlet that hates them and hates the jobs they use, hates the economy that spurs on Kentucky. It's an outrage, and Mitch McConnell should know better. He has been the victim of NPR and PBS, but I'll tell you, Jim, last night, he voted with the Democrats on the procedural motions to bring this bill to the floor today.
And see, Dan, that's what causes, I think, a lot of consternation here in our state because, conservatives are paying attention to this, and it's the inconsistency, apparent inconsistency. And I mean, there may be good reasons at times, but you cited also the coverage of the convention, 72% negative for the Republican National Convention, 88% positive for the Democratic Convention. How does this imbalance manifest in their reporting? Why should Kentuckians care about this?
Look, MSNBC and CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, they're biased. You mentioned that at the top of this interview. They're private entities. They're allowed to be biased. Market incentives are what will control their behavior. Right. As their readership drops, their viewership drops, we hope they'll change. But PBS and NPR, the only market incentive they've had over the years is the federal dollar, the federal dole. And they've always thought that they're completely insulated from Congress stripping them of their funding. The only way to control them, the only way to bring them back to any kind of normalcy is to end the forced taxpayer subsidies of these things. And today, that can happen.
You mentioned that NPR's newsroom has 87 registered Democrats and 0 Republicans. How, and of course, with journalists, and I remember, with guys like Walter Cronkite and going back in time.
Roger Mudd.
Yeah, we knew those guys leaned left, right? But, personally. But they were always so professional about, I think, generally speaking, not allowing those biases to creep into their reporting, at least for the most part. I think pretty consistent.
For the most part.
But now this has become more important, hasn't it? This has become more of an issue, right, because of the current environment. We're not in that environment anymore.
Right. On NPR, the show All Things Considered,
right.
We've done study after study after study for 36 years. All Things Considered. This year so far, 36 liberal guests like Joy Reid and other radicals, 0 conservative guests. 36 liberals, 0 conservatives. You go down the line. Washington Week, 90+% negative coverage of Republicans while extolling the virtues of Joe Biden. And this is what you get on NPR and PBS. Another study we did, using the term far left or hard left versus the use of the term hard right or far right, across all TV broadcasters, including MSNBC, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS, the ratio was 14-1. 14 times more often they use the term far right. But PBS was the worst, 42 times more often using the term far right than far left. Everything they do is slanted to help the Democrats. And Mitch McConnell, as the former Senate Majority Leader, as somebody who's going to set the standard for future Republican leaders, needs to do the right thing. Stay with the conservatives and help Kentuckians no longer be forced to have their taxes used to subsidize these radical media outlets.
Yeah, they're using our tax dollars to subsidize views that most of us don't hold. I mean, all the polling shows that. We're speaking with Dan Schneider, Vice President of the Media Research Center here on Kentucky's Voice. Don't go away. And when we come back, I want to talk about what's the answer here and more about this issue of bias in the media. Stay with us here on Kentucky's Voice. Don't go away. Glad to have with us Dan Schneider today on the program. Dan is the Vice President of the Media Research Center. And we're also glad to have you with us today. You can weigh in on this at 502-571-0970. That's our Kentucky's Voice text line. And you can also support the program. Find the information on the screen there. Text KY Voice to 53555. And Dan, we're talking about media bias, particularly in public broadcasting. What's the answer here? Is it to impose some kind of political quota on newsrooms? How would that work? You know, because you made a pretty big point about the public broadcasting newsroom being totally one-sided in their political leanings. But is that the answer? And of course, I know part of this is just don't publicly fund broadcasting outlets, right? We could talk about that, but talk about that in terms of let's say that doesn't happen. Let's say that we continue to have this, and people say we want this, and I don't know that's going to happen. I don't think there's a great outcry to keep it this way for any reason. I think a lot of people enjoy some of the programming on public broadcasting, but first of all, what's the answer here?
When we're talking about the broader media landscape, people need to understand this is a dying model. You know, the Louisville Courier-Journal.
Yeah.
How much longer is it going to continue to exist? Its readership is declining. Its ad revenues have completely flipped upside down.
The Herald used to be the same way here in Lexington, same way. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it used to be that 80% of profits for these papers came from advertising, and now almost none of it comes from that because of the internet. And so now these outlets are trying to make money by subscription services. That used to be the minority pot of money. But why do people want to buy a subscription to the Louisville paper, the Lexington paper, when they can get content online, the content they want? All these outlets are in trouble.
Yeah. How much of that is, too, what I think one of the things as an observer of this for a while here now is that it seems like they've doubled down on their progressive, sometimes radical even views, certainly out of touch with a lot of Kentuckians here on the socially conservative issues like DEI, like gender issues. How much, does that, I think that's shocking that, if what you're doing is not working, but to double down on what you're doing in terms of not, of conservative reader, like most of us are, not really finding a place there, not really feeling like their views are represented. I mean, how much of it has to do with that, do you think?
Yeah, if you go back 100 years, we had partisan media. We always have had partisan media. Media started off as a partisan platform for the various parties. That's always going to be the case. But we've had massive consolidation where there in Lexington, you may have had 10 options before. Now that essentially there's one dominant paper. But these papers have continued their historical role in politics, meaning the left. They bought up the right of center competitors, and now we only have left-wing news. And that's why that's one of the reasons it's a dying model. People don't want to read the paper in Lexington or in Louisville. It runs contrary to their interests, and they have alternatives.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk in a minute, too, about, I think there's opportunity here. But before I get to that, I'm somewhat torn on this in terms of what we have going on here in Kentucky. And I think I should point this out. I mean, we have here the Kentucky Educational Television setup, which has been very objective in their coverage. In fact, they've been very intentional about including groups like the Bluegrass Institute, like the Commonwealth Policy Center, like the Family Foundation in their discussions, because they have debates and they really do want to have both sides. And sometimes we help find those people if we're not the right people. So, which is great. And I think that's a great model. So I think, and they do share-a-thons. They raise a lot of their own funding here. So that seems to me to be the best answer. If you like the product and you want to support it, then you can help fund that. I think that's great. It's just like this program. People want conservative media and conservative talk radio and television here. They can support it, and they will support it. I guess, and it's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier, the folks who lead the operation here who are on the air, the faces, they tend to lean left, and everybody kind of knows that personally. But they've done a great job of giving us on the center right a pretty fair hearing. And I do think that comes from, knowing that local outlets are willing to call them out if they don't operate fairly, that we're willing to do that here. So, and that I think it helps too when you have such a supermajority of Republicans in the legislature, because a lot of their work depends on being able to talk to those legislators and be at the table. So there is some more, I think, higher level of accountability here for more fair hearings and more fair coverage. So I think that's a different dynamic maybe within our state than if you look at the national landscape of this, which you certainly did a great job of pointing out what those issues are. But it's still a legitimate question, is it not, of how entities are funded to get to that? And I think you made a great point too. We see this with government, don't we, Dan, a lot, that there's well-intentioned, programs can begin usually smaller than what they've grown to be. There's good intention there. I think with public broadcasting, there was good intention to provide public programming, and certainly I don't necessarily question the intentions there. But isn't that what we see so often with government programs? We could name them, and so often with a lot of the funding, that they are well-intentioned, but they begin to grow, and ideology gets in there, and you have folks who begin to control that and begin to use it for their own political means, and it's just fraught with those kinds of dangers.
Now, you've just named the two problems connected with any kind of government program. The first one is, well-intentioned but bad. You may recall Bill Clinton's midnight basketball effort to try to address poverty, and it turned out that his midnight basketball program actually increased poverty and increased crime. All it did was put the criminals all together in the same place where they engaged in more criminal conduct.
Too late at
So
night.
good intentions can lead to really bad results.
Right.
And then the other thing is the left is smart. And the left has tried to capture all these important institutions, academia, media, other government agencies, entertainment. They are hell-bent on pushing a radical agenda. And they know that to do that, they have to capture these institutions. Kentucky, I'm glad to hear that Kentucky is a bit different when it comes to educational television. But across the country, the left has captured these institutions. And this is to their own demise, because this is, frankly, what has led to MAGA. People on both sort of the center and the right are fed up with being force-fed from these radicals, a radical Marxist kind of ideology, and they're pushing back. And whether it's sort of the modest left or the center or the right, people have come together to say, no more. We want our country back.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the folks on the left who talk about tolerance certainly are not tolerant, are very intolerant of views other than their own. And we saw that with Hillary Clinton's God's guns and, her whole shtick about Donald Trump's supporters, which was not helpful for her campaign at all. Hey, we're talking with Dan Schneider today, Vice President of the Media Research Center. Dan, thanks so much for taking some time with us today. I think there's an opportunity here too, with the technology, and this is the upside, I think, of the technology. We hear a lot of negative about it, but, I think the web and the internet and the social media, while there's a lot of danger there in a lot of areas, there's also a lot of opportunity. Talk about how Kentuckians should take advantage of some of these issues and some of the things that are happening, developments in the media to how can we make a good opportunity? I think this program here, what we're doing here, is certainly a part of that. But how can individuals take advantage of this?
Yeah, well, you're right. Technology has allowed people to go around the institutionally controlled media to get news and information that they couldn't otherwise have access to. What we did see over the last, say, 5 or 6 years is that big tech which is run by liberals and hardcore leftists. They were trying to discriminate against people. And Jim, I was actually in the Supreme Court hearing the oral argument last year in what was referred to as the net choice cases. And the attorneys for big tech were literally arguing that these big tech companies have a right to discriminate for any reason. They're literally trying to resurrect the old Plessy versus Ferguson standard of separate but equal, but even in a worse scenario, claiming that big tech can discriminate against black people, They can kick people out of Uber cars. They can discriminate against people based on political viewpoint. These are common carriers. And by common law, common carriers are not allowed to discriminate. But that's where big tech is today. So we have to prevent big tech from discriminating. But even as discriminating as they have been, it's still a better outlet to reach people than legacy media. Mm-hmm. And we've just seen over and over and over these new startups, of conservative voices using social media platforms to communicate ideas, getting around the barriers that the left has established. And that's why we're now winning races that we never won before.
Well, that's a great point. And, I talk about the impact for just a moment. We have just a couple of minutes left, but I think Donald Trump, this may be an area where he's had a really positive impact. He's disrupted, or maybe when he came in, it was already beginning, but he sort of accelerated the disruption of the legacy media and forcing them in many cases to acknowledge other points of view as much as they dislike doing that. Having a Scott Jennings on CNN, for example, or something like that, forcing them to do that. We might not have seen that happen. How much do you think that has mattered here and played a role? This.
Look, in his first term, the media gave him no quarter. He would call them fake news. That did not change the media's reaction to them, other than to make them hardened against him than ever, more hardened than ever before. This term, it's different. Both the big tech outlets and certain media outlets that are owned by big tech, they have decidedly softened the blow. They're still left wing. But the owner of the Washington Post is a big tech guy,
right? And
he knows that he could lose all of his contracts if he doesn't start to play fair. So we are seeing improvements in the media in many cases. But back to our original conversation, NPR and PBS have only doubled down in their radicalism, and they've got to be defunded today, tomorrow, whenever the vote takes place.
And if you're out there and you're saying you're a mom, say, hey, my kids like Sesame Street and some of these other programs. I don't, I think the programs that are in demand there's going to be a way found to fund them. They may be on your commercial TV station, but hey, so what? If you can get to it, who cares nowadays, right? That's great. Well, Dan Schneider, our time's gone way too quick, but I've sure enjoyed this conversation today. Thank you for the stand you're taking. Thank you for the work you're doing at the Media Research Center, and thank you for joining us today. This has been insightful. We appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Thanks.
And God bless. Stay with us here on Kentucky's Voice. Andy Beshear running for president.
Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
And Jim Waters back with you here on Kentucky's Voice. Glad to have Dan Schneider in our last couple of segments here on the program today. And after we went off, he made the point that, hey, Sesame Street has been owned by HBO now for several years. They've had the rights to it. So I mentioned that in the last segment. So no worries there. Sesame Street isn't going anywhere. And some of your other favorite programming has already been picked up. And that just proves the point that that a program that's popular and in demand, the market will find a way to fund it, and it'll be there for you. So there's no need for us to pour billions of taxpayer dollars into public broadcasting, especially when they're going to double down on their bias against the center-right views and principles that most of us have. But the good programming, the good stuff is already moving elsewhere. So I appreciate Dan Schneider, Vice President of the Media Research Center, for pointing that out today. And let's switch gears now a little bit here on Kentucky's Voice in this last segment. Thanks for joining us today. By the way, love to hear your comments at 502-571-0970, our Kentucky's Voice text line. Also, you can text to give 53555, text KY Voice to 53555 and support this conservative media programming. University leaders were in Frankfurt yesterday to update lawmakers on how they're complying with legislation passed during this year's General Assembly session that abolishes House Bill 4, which abolishes all diversity, equity, and inclusion programming in offices at the state's universities. Here's a full report on that from, ironically, Kentucky Public Television, KET's Kentucky Edition, and then we'll come back and discuss.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives, have come to a halt at Kentucky's public universities. During today's Budget Review Subcommittee on Education, the University of Kentucky shared that they disbanded their Office of Institutional Diversity last August, before House Bill 4 was introduced. UK's provost explained what happened to those programs.
Programs formerly housed in this office were either discontinued or revised to make clear that the services and resources are available to all students and employees in ways consistent with the law.
Legislators weren't fully satisfied with UK's testimony, however. They asked for more details on if the university was still offering discriminatory courses, and Senator Stephen West wanted more information on how much money the university is saving.
We want to know that, the taxpayer dollars are being well spent, student dollars are being well spent, and just, I guess I would request a little bit more detail.
Another university which took action before the legislative session was NKU. They dissolved their Office of Inclusive Excellence last August and have formed a new initiative, which they say is unrelated to DEI.
The focus of the North Center for Belonging is going to be on first-generation students and on commuter students. So NKU can be, I think, is somewhat unique in the fact that a large proportion of our students are commuter students. That's going to be one of the big focuses of that center, to fill a need that we think there's an opportunity to fill.
The University of Louisville has realigned millions of dollars and shared about their new resource center.
This unit will include the Center for Military Connected Students, the Disability Resource Center, and other resource centers aimed at supporting success for all university students.
Kentucky State University is the Commonwealth's only publicly funded historically black college and university. They removed their diversity officer positions years ago, saying they didn't need them in the first place.
KSU was founded in response to discrimination, so it will never enable or promote discrimination of any kind, whether on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, political belief, or social belief.
Morehead and Murray State Universities emphasized their focus has always been on low-income students rather than DEI programs. Morehead State's president said they never had a diversity office.
As many of you know, Morehead State University has over 50% of our students are low-income students, and that's where we place the majority of our emphasis.
We serve a very high percentage of first-generation, low-income, marginalized students. And so our support services, I believe, at Murray State University are second to none, and we'll continue to support those students.
At WKU, the provost formed a committee to evaluate courses and ensure the content encourages a multitude of perspectives.
They're examining syllabi and sampling course content to ensure that alternate viewpoints are presented along with dominant perspectives, that course material reflects a broad range of ideological perspectives, and that assessments do not require adoption of specific viewpoints.
Eastern Kentucky University and KCTCS shared that they have adopted institutional neutrality policies. Each university official said they'll continue to monitor their compliance with the law as the new academic year begins. For Kentucky Edition, I'm Emily Sisk.
And so the universities are complying with the law here, and it's amazing how money talks. Money from the state government flows to universities. It's a significant portion of our budget. It's not the largest part, but it's a significant portion of our state budget. And so there are incentives there for universities to adhere to the wishes of the legislature, and we heard that report. I want to point out a couple of things. I think Andrea Anderson, the general counsel at Western Kentucky University, who was pretty much the last voice in that clip, I think, as far as folks who testified in Frankfurt yesterday before the budget subcommittee on education, talked about all viewpoints being included, and that's the point here. I don't think we should be forcing viewpoints on students who come to our universities. I think we should be exposing them to all points of view, and then teaching them how to think critically about those issues and how to arrive at their own conclusions that will help base and form the principles that they live on and that they develop their careers on. So this is not about not teaching, for example, Marxism, or not teaching about communism, or not teaching about socialism, or not teaching about the different views of very controversial issues like marriage or like abortion. But it's, first of all, it's making sure that all points of view are accurately represented and that no point of view is forced upon students, but then they are taught how to think about these, how to question it, how to study it, how to research it, and how to arrive at the conclusions that they do, based not on what some ideological professor told them or environment forced upon them, but based upon their own belief system and what they arrived at. So I think this is one of the complaints that conservatives and Christians have had with higher education, is they say our kids are well grounded in the church and the scripture and in what they believe, and then they go to college and they come home a different person, okay? And I don't think that's right either. I think they should come home a more well-rounded person, a more educated person. After all, that's what the purpose of going to school or college is for, right? Is for education. And so there's a difference in talking about educating students versus indoctrinating students. And that's what we had going on. We had not only radical points of view in many cases that were in direct opposition to Christian point of views, conservative point of views, but we also had a poo-pooing or a direct assault on views that happened to be different than what was being taught in the college classroom. And that's a no-no. That's absolutely wrong. And I think our legislators were concerned about that. They were concerned about universities officially teaching or officially endorsing a point of view, especially when it was so out of sorts with what's generally accepted. Now, I don't think that should be forced on on students either. I think they should be exposed to the truth about all of these issues of what's been written, who their heroes were, what was said about them. They should read about it, and then they should have all of that information. That's really important, that all points of view and all information be out there, and then students will have the freedom in this country to believe and accept what they want to teach. And I think that's why it's important that projects like Kentucky's Voice be out there, because that needs to be heard. We're not forcing this on you, but we want to make sure you hear from an objective and from a fact-filled point of view what we believe. And so the ACLU, by the way, is challenging taxpayer-funded gender transition policies that the legislature passed. Senate Bill 2, which bans taxpayer-funded gender transitions for prisoners. The ACLU is opposing this, and I just have to point out the lead plaintiff in this case, by the way, is a convicted murderer, Matthew Paul Smith, guy named Matthew Paul Smith. The lawsuit is attempting to create a constitutional right for prisoners to have access to gender transition procedures. And this is in direct opposition, of course, to what the General Assembly passed, Senate Bill 2 in this year. It passed the House 73-12, the Senate 31-6. The governor's administration had tried to push for such procedures without legislative approval. And they tried to do it through regulation and during the interim. And, of course, the legislature stepped up and said that's not going to work. Now, here's why I bring this story up about Beshear. His refusal... on the one hand, he tried to sneak this regulation through. On the other hand, when the bill was passed, he refused to veto it, which he has most other bills that he's disagreed with. He's vetoed most conservative bills. So this raises questions about his priorities, I think. And, you know, this law actually affects very few people. I mean, it's fewer than 100 prisoners, I think, and I think it's like 60 to 70 prisoners are affected or could be affected under this. But the issue highlights broader concerns about this governor and about his governance and what his priorities are. And, of course, I said before the break that he's really considering running for president, which is no big surprise here. He's considering a potential run. And I guess he had a conversation with some national publications like The Hill and said he's running. But he's not very well known. He only got 2% in this kind of a straw poll versus, I think, Kamala Harris, who got 13%, Buttigieg, who got 16%, Ayok, who got much more than that, Josh Shapiro and others. So he's not very well known. I'm sure he'll be putting together a campaign to change that, and we'll make sure his record is clear right here on Kentucky's Voice. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day, everyone. God bless.